So hello everyone. My name is Megan Beats, for those of you who don't know me. I am on the board of the chorus and I sing in the alto section. So I want to welcome everyone to the first class in our brand new Schiller NYC Chorus Summer Music Lecture Series. So we can't all be together making music as we would like to, but we can come together in this forum to spend some time discussing, learning, and hopefully gaining a deeper insight into some of the principles behind musical composition, the singing voice, and since this is the year of Beethoven, extended into 2021, about Beethoven. So our plan is we'll hold these classes every 2 weeks on Sundays at 4:30, with the exception of the August 9th class, which I'll say something about in a moment. So just to give you a quick overview, I'll introduce today's class in a minute. In 2 weeks, on July 26th, we'll have a class on the genius of Wilhelm Furtwängler. On August 9th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll have a class from our friend Liliana Gorini from Italy on the fight for the Verdi tuning. On August 23rd, we'll learn about Beethoven and his compositional method from Michwa Steger. On September 6th, I'll teach a class on Kepler's Harmony of the World. And on September 20th, we will have a class by Fred Haight on Beethoven as an American Composer, Part 2. Now, with that, let me introduce today's speaker, who is Fred Haight, who will teach a class on Beethoven as an American Composer, Part 1. So Fred is a longtime member of the Schiller Institute. He has been applying himself to understanding classical art and the role that classical art must play in leading humanity out of this crisis for about the past 5 decades. You can also find 3 of Fred's classes up on the chorus website, which we can put in the chat in just a moment. And he's also been producing the Daily Dose of Beethoven for the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture, which you can find on their webpage, and he's up to number 100 or so. So without further ado, I want to introduce Fred Haight and just tell you that after Fred presents what he wants to present to us, we'll have a chance to open up for questions and dialogue. So you'll have a chance to tell him all that's on your mind. So, Fred. Nope, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Oh, okay, good. Welcome to a class on Beethoven as an American composer. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I will try to move fairly quickly, but I know that glitches occur in these things, so if there's a glitch and you miss something, let me know. And if the videos or if the visuals or the audios don't come up, let me know, because I don't want to miss that stuff. But I'm going to start out by showing one of the visuals. Can you see that?
We see your folder.
No. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. So why do I say Beethoven is an American composer? I mean, he never set foot in this country. We have one quote from him where he says that we can certainly understand the Americans' demands for independence, but does that make him an American composer? Partially, we have to counter certain lies and false notions, one of which is the notion of Beethoven as a titan wrestling against the gods. And you see that in this picture. You see him carrying around his own personal storm cloud, perhaps consulting it. This notion of Beethoven as a titan wrestling against the gods seeks to mystify his existence, make it impossible to understand. Where did he come from? We don't know. How is he possible? We don't know. How is it possible to ever do this again, to create someone like him? We don't know. It's a once-in-a-millennium experience. We should enjoy it, but not try to understand it. And in fact, that statement, Beethoven as a Titan wrestling against the gods, was coined by Richard Wagner. And with friends like that, you don't need enemies. Praising Beethoven to disguise, but trying to make him totally incomprehensible. Now I'm going to go on to the next picture. And okay, is that visible?
Nope, just your folder.
How about that? What this? Got it now?
Yes.
Okay. So what do we mean by Beethoven as an American composer? He was born in 1770, 6 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And in the last part of that century, the 18th century, there was a movement sweeping the world towards freedom, towards equality, towards education, towards the founding of nation states. And it was probably one of the most optimistic periods in history. A lot of people actually did believe that it was possible to overcome feudalism and establish a kingdom of reason on earth. And I would say the leader of that was the poet Friedrich Schiller, which is why we are the Schiller Institute. And Schiller wrote a poem called The Artists, and one phrase in it says, "Man's honor is confided to your hand, its protector be. It sinks with you it shall arise." That's his challenge to the artist. He's not saying, as people have believed recently, that the artist's job is to show everybody how bad everything is. He's saying that the artist has to educate the population and lead them, and that it's your responsibility. And Schiller said a rather amazing thing in his aesthetic letters and other places. He said that art had better change fast if it's not going to be left behind by life. And what he meant by that is the Declaration of Independence was a great work of art, not only in its words, but also in the founding of a republic, a nascent nation state, which, despite all of the problems, had the potential to become a more perfect union, and that art was going to have to catch up to that. And I believe that of all the artists I have looked at in that period, Beethoven is the one who took him the most seriously on that, who realized what Schiller was saying and understood that art had to escalate itself to that level. Now, as for the question of being an American composer, see, if you believe, like they say today, that the American Revolution was just a bunch of rich white men who wanted to take control from the people in England ruling them, then it doesn't make any sense. This movement towards freedom and equality was sweeping around the world, and people who were a part of it and looking at it saw what was going on in the United States as a beachhead, that if it could be accomplished, if the American Revolution could be won, then their cause could prosper too. So you had international support for the American Revolution that is often not recognized today. For instance, does anybody know what the first country was to really support the United States? Not openly recognize them, but support us?
Russia.
Nope. Can you see the picture?
Is it Morocco?
Yeah, that's right. Can you see the picture?
Yeah.
Yes.
That is Sultan Muhammad III of Morocco with an American ship in his harbor. In 1777, only 1 year into the American Revolution, Morocco granted the right of American ships to harbor there, much to the displeasure of the British, who of course had the most powerful navy in the world. A little later, they signed a friendship treaty with us, but Morocco was actually the first place in the world to come to the aid and support of the United States. Can you see this picture?
Not yet.
Okay. Now?
Yeah.
Okay. This is Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia, who formed the League of Armed Neutrality. The British wanted to stop anybody from trading with the American colonies and starve them out. And she worked with the Dutch and others to say, look, we are not at war with the United States. We will deliver goods there, and we will defend ourselves. So she kept trade open with the United States. Here's another guy. Does he look like one of the founding fathers to you? Anybody know who this is? His name is Hyder Ali, and he was the leader of the kingdom of Mysore in what is today India. And he led a rebellion against the British for many years called the Mysore Rebellion. And though he had his own reasons for doing it, he was quite happy to tie up British troops and ships, which were intended to be sent to suppress the American Revolution. And Hyder Ali, another Muslim leader, became a hero in the United States. People wrote poems about them. They were published in newspapers. And in fact, the Continental Congress commissioned a ship to be built in Philadelphia named the Hyder Ali, which actually did sail and participate in the war, in the Revolutionary War. And then we have a poem called Ode for General Washington's Birthday. Where'd it go? Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. This is called Ode for General Washington's Birthday, written in England in 1794 during George Washington's presidency, at a time in which it was very dangerous for him to do this. And he said things in it like, see gathering thousands while I sing, a broken chain exulting bring, and dash it in a tyrant's face, and dare him to his very beard, and tell him he no more is feared, no more the despot of Columbia's race. That is written by Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, whom Beethoven set to music several times, including Auld Lang Syne. So you get the idea that the American Revolution was not just some local affair, but it was global. And the support for it was global by people who were fighting for the same thing. Now, in the case of Beethoven, I want to go a little bit into his upbringing in the city of Bonn, because Beethoven was not just a product of his times, he was a product of an effort to create someone like himself. Some of you have heard of the Emperor Joseph II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor of the Habsburg lands, who was the patron of Mozart, who did many things, encouraged universal education, equality of the law before everybody, and other things, and was just generally seen as a very enlightened monarch. It was the drive towards freedom was strong enough that many people actually did believe that all human beings were created equal under God. And Joseph was the guy who supported Mozart to create a German language opera, the Abduction from the Seraglio. What's less known is that he had a brother, younger brother, known as Max Franz. You see the picture?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Max Franz was the elector of Cologne, and that included the city of Bonn, and he decided to create a crash program, an Apollo project almost, to generate and develop a culture in that city that would educate artists, musicians, and composers. And that's what Beethoven grew up in. What did he do? I mean, for one thing, he created a youth orchestra in which Beethoven played. This youth orchestra generated 5 composers that I know of. Andreas Romberg, who wrote a complete setting of Schiller's The Bells, his brother, Anton Reicha, who headed the Paris Conservatory for a while, and Ferdinand Ries, who became Beethoven's lifelong friend. So one orchestra generates 5 composers, 4 decent ones, 1 great one. But how do you do it? How do you actually educate a great composer? You pick out some kid and say, this is going to be the person that we educate to and put all of our hopes in? No, you have to educate everybody, and at the highest level. So it was an intense education for everybody involved in it. And they didn't know that Beethoven was going to be the one who actually came out, but that's what they were looking for. That's what they were trying to accomplish. Now, what else did he do? I can't even see this. There was a national theater in Bonn, which had been a court theater. Max Franz turned it into a public theater so that everybody could attend it. The director of that theater was a guy named Grossmann. Gustav Friedrich Wilhelm Grossmann. He ran one of the best theater companies in the world, produced many of the works of Shakespeare there in German translation. So Beethoven, as a boy, grew up with Shakespeare, whom he loved. He had, during his life, he had 2 different complete versions of the works of Shakespeare. He also produced plays by Lessing and plays by Schiller, and in fact, Schiller's drama, Fiesco, had its world premiere in Bonn, which was considered kind of a backwaters at the time. They also wanted to create opera, and Grossmann collaborated with a musician to write an opera. He wrote the libretto, and the musician wrote the music in 1780. Anybody want to take a guess as to who the musician was? It wasn't Beethoven. He was only 10 at the time. It was this guy. This is Christian Gottlieb NEFA, who was Beethoven's piano teacher. So he composed the music for a major opera with Grossmann, which was played at this National Theater, which Beethoven attended. NEFA was an associate of the Baron von, not the, I forget his name right now, the Baron who introduced Mozart to Bach and Handel. And he made sure that Beethoven studied all of the preludes and fugues of Bach as a boy. But he was also much more than that. He was the leader of the Freemasons in Bonn, and he was the head of the Lesegesellschaft, the Reading Society. They had reading societies throughout Europe. And in the Reading Society, this drive towards equality took place, because in the Reading Society, you didn't have rank. They didn't address each other as Sir or Count or Graf. or anything like that. Everybody was on an equal level, and they read the most profound works, including the works of ancient philosophers such as the Greeks and Romans. At least 40% of the members of the youth orchestra in which Beethoven participated were members of the Lesegesellschaft. So they were being educated not only in music, but in classical reading and literature. And it should not surprise us that Beethoven said at one point that there is scarcely a book too learned for me not to understand. So this is Beethoven as an intellectual and a thinker, not, you know, the Titan wrestling against the gods. What else did they have in Bonn? They had, they wanted to develop opera, so they brought in visiting opera companies and learned from Italian opera. Beethoven had the job of providing the continuo. He sat at the harpsichord or keyboard and had a bass line from which he had to reconstruct basically the whole opera. So he learned Italian opera inside out during this period in Bonn. And just to give you an idea, we don't think of Beethoven as a prodigy because his first published works were not until he was 25 years old. But I'm going to play a piece for you. I'm not going to tell you how old he was when he composed it. I'm just going to let you guess. That was the not so well-known portrait of Beethoven at the age of 12, and that's how old he was when he composed this. One of his jobs at the opera was, you had visiting composers who would come and perform their operas. This is Giovanni Paisiello. He wrote the opera La Molinera, which was performed in Bonn when Beethoven was a young man. He was also one of the Italian composers who went on to Russia to develop the St. Petersburg choir into one of the best choirs in the world. And he wrote a very famous duet for La Molinera. And I'm just going to play for you the opening of it. I'm sure that many people here will recognize it.
Nel cor più non mi sento brillare la gioventù, cagion del mio tormento. Amor, sei poco in pace, mi pizzichi, mi stuzzichi, mi pungichi, mi mastichi, che cose questo in me? Pietà, 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 amore un certo che
Now, one of the things that many young composers did was they composed theme and variations. They would take a very popular opera piece. This is something that everybody knew, and write a theme and variations on it. And Beethoven was there when Paisiello performed La Malinera in Bonn, and then he composed a set of theme and variations on the piece. I'm just going to play you the theme and the first variation. He plays the theme straight so that everybody will recognize it, and then I'll ask you to hear in the first variation the problem with most modern pianists, because it's an easy piece and they just speed through it. But I've looked at a number of these pieces, and what the composer does is they state the theme as a simple operatic theme, and then the first variation is a florid coloratura type of variation on it. And that's what this should be if anybody wanted to play it right on the piano. You can hear that, but it's too fast. So just listen to that. Here's the theme. Now, the first variation, and you can hear that it's imitating the voice. Now, I want to take a minute to introduce you to another unknown piece by Beethoven, because his first published works were the Opus 1 trios at the age of 25. When Joseph II died in 1790, the 19-year-old Beethoven was commissioned to write a cantata, and which he did. It's a 35-minute long cantata. It was considered so difficult. They didn't. Excuse me, for heavens. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine.
Oh, okay.
Did you turn on original sound?
We
I've
got
had
it.
that on. I think somebody unmuted is what happened. Anyhow, he wrote this cantata, and it was considered too difficult. It was actually not performed until 100 years later. And when I listened to it, I listened to the choral writing in it and the writing for vocal quartet, and I hear a lot of the later Beethoven choral writing. But it certainly gives the lie to the idea that he did not know the human voice. This is a beautiful aria in which the chorus soon joins in. But this is, bear in mind, this is 5 years before his first published piece. It's a major work and a beautiful work, and really worth studying. When I first listened to it, it really bowled me over. I couldn't believe that this was written 5 years before the piano trios. But let's move ahead and look at the question of Beethoven as an American composer one more time. Beethoven was a Promethean. For people who don't know the story of Prometheus, Prometheus was the Titan, the god, who stole the gift of fire from Zeus and gave it to man, gave man the gift of fire and every other type of knowledge. Zeus, who wished to keep man as a human cattle or human sheep, was furious with him because this could allow man to become independent and not need the gods anymore. So he punished Prometheus by having him chained to a rock and having a eagle come out and eat out his liver every single day. And since Prometheus was a god, he couldn't die. He had to go through this punishment on a daily basis. In Aeschylus' play, Prometheus Bound, all of Prometheus' friends are begging with him to compromise just a little bit. He said, if you compromise a little bit, Zeus will not punish you so hard. And Prometheus' attitude was, no, you cannot compromise on such moral issues. And he ended up winning. And Beethoven, to me, is like that. When I look at him and look at him politically, he is probably the most uncompromising person that I have ever run into. People have perhaps heard this famous quote where he broke ties with Prince Lichnowsky, where he says that, Prince, you are what you are by an accident of birth. I am what I am because of what I made myself to be. There have been and will be 1,000 princes. There is only one Beethoven. That's a famous statement, but I got curious as to what actually occasioned the break, because Lichnowsky was a major supporter of Beethoven. And what it was is that after Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804, and Beethoven scratched out the dedication to Napoleon on his Third Symphony, the Eroica, the French defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 and occupied Vienna, something that Beethoven hated. He was very, very upset at having French soldiers sitting in the audience at the world premiere of Fidelio, his opera, in 1805. And his break with Lichnowsky was that Lichnowsky wanted to compromise. He invited Beethoven out to his country estate, and when he got there, there were French soldiers there whom Lichnowsky had invited, and he asked Beethoven to play for them. And Beethoven refused. He stormed out of the place, went home, smashed his bust of Prince Lichnowsky, and from thence followed that famous statement. But in every situation I've ever seen like that, Beethoven always absolutely refused to compromise morally or politically. Let's look at another aspect of this. These guys, people like Beethoven and Schiller, were studying all kinds of historical events that had to do with the fight for freedom. Can you see the picture there?
No.
Okay. Let me try it again. How about now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. This is a painting from 1562 by Bruegel called The Triumph of Death, and it's about when Philip II of Spain invaded the Netherlands under the guise of the Spanish Inquisition and just murdered a lot of people. You can't see the picture
Right.
very
Can you
clearly.
make it a little bigger like you did some of the other ones?
You know what? Oh, yeah. Okay. It's still not very clear, but there are skeletons dressed up as priests, people being sacrificed all along the way. It's a pretty hideous picture, and Philip really believed in a show of force to intimidate people. So 3 different works were written in this time in Germany that actually discuss these matters, because even though it was 250 years earlier, it was considered a very important precedent for what was taking place then. You had Schiller's play Don Carlos, which I'm sure many people here have read, Schiller's essay on the history of the revolts in the Netherlands, and Goethe's play Egmont. Beethoven was asked to provide the music for Egmont, which he gladly did. And I presume that most people have heard the Egmont Overture, but I'm going to show you something that you may not have noticed before. Egmont was not a great guy. He was an oligarch. He was kind of half in with the Spanish, half in with the people. But Alba, the evil Duke of Alba, invited him for dinner to hash things out, and then arrested him and had him executed along with about 1,000 other people. And the outrage was so great that it eventually did lead to an uprising. And didn't take place quite as quickly as it does in Beethoven's overture. But I'm going to play the very end of this overture. And what Beethoven is quite clearly describing is the scene where Egmont is executed, a short prayer afterwards, and then this stirring of the rising up of the people in revolt over it. So Beethoven is not only uncompromising. He's also a total optimist, and it's not optimism with rose-colored glasses on, because he knew what he was up against. When Napoleon was first appointed, when he first pulled off a coup in 1799 and made himself first consul, he did try to do a lot of actually fairly good things in terms of education, eliminating the oligarchy, etc. And Beethoven supported him. He wrote his Third Symphony, the Eroica or Heroic Symphony, and called it the Bonaparte Symphony, dedicated it to Napoleon. But when Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, and Beethoven found out about it, he ripped out the inscription and said, now he too will become a tyrant and trample on the rights of men. And he rededicated the symphony to the memory of a great man. Here is just the beginning of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. This notion of this Promethean notion of a hero, of a leader who was going to lead humanity out of the Dark Ages was something very real to him. This was one of the longest symphonies ever written, because he was dedicating it to this idea of a great leader and a great cause. When Napoleon did go bad and Beethoven changed the inscription, he changed his notion of heroic leader to a woman, to Leonora, in his opera Fidelio. I don't know of anything before that has ever celebrated the heroic role of a woman as greatly as Beethoven does in Fidelio. And the story is quite clearly based on the story of the Marquis de Lafayette and his wife, Adrienne. This was identified 40 years ago by Don Fowle, but Dave Shaven has recently done some excellent work on it. He hasn't published an article yet, but I did a summary of it on June 26th in these daily doses of Beethoven at the Foundation website. And Dave has presented very, very strong evidence that this, in fact, is what it was about. It was a cause célèbre at the time. Lafayette was the hero of the American Revolution. He spent 5 years in jail, including in terrible conditions, latrines running underneath him. And his wife, Adrienne, insisted on getting a meeting with the emperor, Franz II, and she did. She forced the meeting, and the emperor just threw up his hands and said, "My hands are tied. I can't do anything." And she said, "Well, then I'm going to go to jail with him." And then she actually did go to jail. Then they removed her for medical treatment and would not let her go back in. But there's no question that Beethoven was aware of this, that I think the original play was based on it, and that is actually what the opera Fidelio is about. It's too long to go into here today. I think maybe next time we might look at it a little more. But I want to, how much time do we have, Megan?
About 10 more minutes before Q&A.
10 minutes
No.
before Q&A. Yeah, that's fine. That's actually good. Uh, I want to share something else with you, which is I said Beethoven was not naive. He was not. He was optimistic to be sure, but he also knew tragedy when he saw it. And I recently just had some insights into his Coriolanus overture. I'm not 100% sure about them, but I'm going to put forth the hypothesis now, which is that Napoleon did declare himself emperor in 1805 and then 1804, and then in 1805 occupied Vienna. In 1804, a playwright named von Collins, Heinrich Joseph von Collins, wrote a play called Coriolan, which addressed the same issue as Shakespeare addressed in his play Coriolanus. And what it's about is a general who's a hero who's gone bad. So it really does strike me that this is what it's about. He wrote the play. Beethoven gladly accepted to write the incidental music for it, and it was premiered in 1807 with Beethoven at the world premiere. Story of Coriolanus is that he was a hero, a Roman general hero, who defeated the Volscian enemy, but had a huge problem because he hated the population. He ran for political office, and all he had to do was show his wounds to the people. That would have been all they wanted to do. But he hated the population so much, he called it like crows pecking at the eagles. He was expelled from Rome, and out of rage went down and joined the Volscians and said, okay, I'm going to lead you in an attack on Rome, and we'll overthrow Rome. And the Romans sent his mother and his family out to convince him otherwise, and he finally says, okay, I won't invade Rome, except he's standing there at the head of an army he's just led to invade Rome, so he gets killed. But being a tragedy of a leader, a general who everybody thought was going to be a hero, but who caved into this flaw, rang a bell at the time. So I'm going to play a little beginning and the end of the Coriolanus overture for you. You'll hear similarities to the Egmont overture, but you'll hear the difference because where that ends triumphantly, this ends tragically. And this is the end. Okay, I want to end with one last thing, because I talked about how courageous and uncompromising Beethoven was. Most of us today don't realize the degree of opposition that he ran into. He had support, but he had absolutely fierce opposition, and I'm just going to give you two examples. After the premiere of his Fourth Symphony, Carl Maria von Weber, who's a fairly well-known composer, wrote a parody where the instruments of the orchestra were attacking it. And he said, "I've just come from the rehearsal of a symphony by one of our newest composers, and you know I have a tolerably strong constitution. I could only hold out, and 5 minutes more would have shattered my frame and burst the sinews of my life. I have been made to caper about like a wild goat and turn myself into a mere fiddle to execute the ideas of Mr. Composer." The first violoncello said that for his part he is too tired to speak and can recollect nothing like he's played before. And the second violoncello is of the opinion that the symphony is a musical monstrosity, revolting alike to the nature of the instruments and the expression of thought, and with no intention whatever but that of the mere show-off. After this, the orchestra attendant enters and threatens them with the Eroica symphony if they are not quiet, and makes a speech in which he tells them that the time has gone for clearness and force, spirit and fancy, and that the following symphony is a caricature. First, a slow movement full of short, disjointed, unconnected ideas at the rate of 3 or 4 notes per quarter of an hour, then a mysterious roll of the drum and passage of the violas, seasoned with the proper quantity of pauses and retardandos, and the end, a furious finale, in which the only requisite is that there should be no ideas for the hearer to make out, but plenty of transitions from one key to another, onto the new note at once, never mind modulating, above all things throw rules to the winds, and for they only hamper a genius. And then many of you sang in the Beethoven Mass in C, right? But that was commissioned by Prince Nicholas Esterházy, not the same prince who sponsored Haydn, but his grandson. And this guy was a real piece of work. When the piece was performed at the Esterházy estate, they had maybe 140 rooms. They put Beethoven in a place that had not been prepared for human habitation. And after the performance, Prince Esterházy had a habit of getting a bunch of people together in the drawing room to discuss the new work. When Beethoven walked into the meeting, which had already started, Esterházy looked at him and said, "My dear Beethoven, what is it that you have done again?" And everybody, including the chorus director, broke out in laughter. Beethoven stormed out, never did dedicate the Mass to Prince Esterházy, never gave him a copy of it. And Esterházy later wrote to a countess, "Beethoven's music is unbearably ridiculous and detestable. I am not convinced it can ever be performed properly. I am angry and ashamed." So that kind of stuff happened all the time, and a lesser soul would have backed down, changed the way he composed. Beethoven responded by going forward even more all the time, and decided that he was writing for the future. He could not be understood in his own time. He was writing for the future. So that's what I got to say, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks a lot, Fred. So I think the way I'd like to try to do this is if you have a question, I'd like you to use the raise hand function in Zoom. And you can find that in the participants window at the bottom. If you click the 3 dots, you'll find raise hand. If you're listening on the phone line, you can dial *9 to indicate that you have a question. So let's try it that way. If that's just not succeeding for you, you can either indicate in the chat that you have a question, or you can just unmute yourself. But let's try the other way first. So Margaret Chaldone, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Fred. This was really great. You know, when you were discussing the question of the great leader, the military leader, who, I mean, what came to my mind was Washington, George Washington, who led, and I know the Chinese were completely blown away that here you had a general, a great military leader who led a successful revolution after a struggle of years, and then it didn't immediately try to establish a dynasty. This had never happened before. At least that's what the Chinese said. And I think that this may have been in Beethoven's mind when he was so cruelly disappointed by Napoleon.
Yeah, you know what, Margaret? When I at another class that I gave in Detroit once, I played that part of the Eroica, and I put a picture of George Washington up, and I said, "This is the guy that it really this is the memory of a great man. This is who it should have been dedicated to." And I don't think Beethoven would have particularly had a problem with that.
Okay. Chefs, go ahead.
There we go. Okay.
Ah.
There were Beethoven was very much celebrated in the United States during the 19th century, and I wonder what you could share that's relevant right now to what you've been saying with respect to the reception that he received here, both among musicians, there were composers at the time, as well as the symphonies and performances of opera over here during his lifetime.
During his lifetime?
Yeah, perhaps shortly. Let's keep it in the frame of his lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah. But to be honest with you, Phil, I really don't know. I think that America was a much more receptive place to his ideas and to his music. I think in Europe he was really running into some hardcore oligarchism. The quotes that I read to you about the Fourth Symphony, that the Third Symphony was hated even more because of what it represented. But do you have anything to offer on that? Because I don't really know that much about that.
No, it was not a leading question. I'm just.
Okay. It's actually, I should look into it. I'll try. If I'm going to come back with part 2 of this by September, I'll look into it for you, and I'll try to have an answer for you then. But it doesn't surprise me that. I mean, we also know how much Schiller was loved in this country. But I don't have a very good background on it right now for you.
Roger?
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if in Beethoven's correspondence or anything of that sort where he ever said anything about the American Revolution.
There is one letter from him that he wrote when he was young, where he said, "You can certainly understand the Americans' demand for independence." And I think that was a fairly bold thing to say in Europe at that time. That's really the only public statement that I've seen. But Dave Shaven has pointed out in the work that he's done on Fidelio and Lafayette that after Lafayette was freed, Beethoven was meeting with the French ambassador in Vienna on a weekly basis, and that there was a lot of denial. I mean, there's a lot of denial that the opera has anything to do with Lafayette, but Dave actually came up with certain poems that were dedicated to Lafayette that had ideas in them like Florestan in jail with an angel appearing next to him, his wife, Adrienne. And that made it into both the original play and the opera. So there's a lot of evidence, I think, very strong, that this actually was based on the case of Lafayette. And the Americans were very involved in it. James Madison was in France and actually arranged for a passport for Adrien Lafayette to be able to travel to Austria and get into that jail. But other than that, no. It was, it was not something, because things got worse. I mean, if we come around to the next time, I'll go into how bad things got after 1815, because as bad as Napoleon was, the Congress of Vienna was worse. And Beethoven had to deal with a really bad situation at that time, a police state, basically. But that's all I know of in terms of direct commentary.
Actually, David Shaven's on and has his hand raised, so maybe, do you want to say
Okay.
something?
Okay.
Oh, sure. I think that you're going to turn the question around. That you won't find much in terms of something written saying, I support the American Revolution. The whole case between 1798 and 1804, when Beethoven's dealing with the French ambassadors, and all the evidence, which I won't go into now, about his hopes that a group of Lafayette-related constitutional Republicans in France, excuse me, constitutional monarchists actually, would get Napoleon to keep him on the right track, is quite extensive. So the really question is how to export the American Revolution to Europe. And it's a touchy question because, from 1791 to 1798, it's like hell in France. Beethoven's convinced that this is the key for turning around Europe. He's also convinced that everything's crazier than all get out. So the type of intervention he wanted to do with the Eroica, which he actually sent to Paris through the French embassy in Vienna, put the icing on it. In the summer of this shocked me. In the summer of 1803, Beethoven announced he's moving to Paris. He's leaving Vienna. Clear indication he's got a group of people there that he's been talking to and working with, that he thinks can move Napoleon in the right way. It's not that dissimilar with trying to move Trump. You figured out somebody is our best shot we got, and you gotta play that card. But Fred, I gotta say one thing. You've said it twice now, and when we talked, I corrected you once. You're still ignoring it. Adrienne never left the jail. When they said under her medical condition that yeah, sure, you can go to Vienna and have your medical condition treated. We just can't let you back in. She said, no, I'll leave here dead before I do that.
Oh, okay.
I'm leaving. It was more. So you're undercutting my girl there, Adrienne.
Yeah, you wrote the article, so.
Okay.
Hey, but do you have any answer for Phil on what he asked about Beethoven?
That's what I'm saying. No, I don't know anything serious about pushing Beethoven in the United States, really, until New York City in the 1840s. I know some about that, about the symphonies they played, the formation of the orchestra. I'm sure there's some stuff I'm forgetting in Beethoven's lifetime or in the 1820s and 30s in America, but I don't have it on the top of my head. And I'm not under the impression that there's a whole lot. There may be little pockets here and there. I'm saying the test of Beethoven on the American Revolution is what he tried to do to import it into Europe.
Yeah.
One last thing on this is on your presentation. I was just amazed. I knew about that cantata that he did when he was 20 years old for Joseph. I'm embarrassed to say I never listened to it. It's so clear he stole from himself. He stole from the future Beethoven on the Fidelio, in that passage that you played, that poignant section.
Yeah, and if you listen to the whole thing and you listen to the choral and vocal quartet sections, you'll hear references to his masses later too.
So the other thing is just the real case is I was making is when Napoleon goes bad. I think it's one of the most Beethoven's optimism was relentless, and when his best hopes of years goes bad, he immediately plunges into the Fidelio, which is not a matter of organizing a great man or having a good angle for changing some government. He actually thinks you have to go even if it doesn't happen in his lifetime, you have to do mass organizing. The scene I focused on was where Adrienne, well, excuse me, Leonore gets to is going down to save the poor man in who she's not sure is her husband. She's ready to save anyone because of the injustice of the situation. And Beethoven has that sort of secular mass with the bread and the wine. I'm not going to try to recreate the music that he plays at that point, but it's a universal mass for mankind in terms of not just like Lincoln's Gettysburg, not just being sorry about people dying or being put to death or being close to put to death, but that what it does to transform the individual and the population. So it's a great thing to try to organize a potential leader of a country around what a potential leader should do with the Eroica. But that got smashed, and he immediately plunges into a whole different type of organizing process. And that for me is what I think it makes Beethoven so relentless. Something bad happened to him, he's going to come out stronger.
Yeah. Yep.
Victor?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just have a series of little short questions. The first question is about the Eroica. In school, most everything I learned about Beethoven was from this movement. But in school, the first thing they teach you is that Beethoven innovated the sonata structure. I was just curious, is there anything important in and of itself, that structure as a 4-part movement? That's the first question.
That he innovated the sonata structure?
Yeah. There's nothing important about that. I think all that means is that there's 3 parts to the composition, or 4 parts.
4 parts. Yeah, I'm very cautious about this whole idea of sonata form, because even though there were precedents for it in Anton Reiche and A.B. Marx, it was invented by Carl Czerny, who was a scoundrel in the 1840s. And I read his book. It's one of the most ridiculous books I've ever read. He basically says that form is fixed. You don't have to be creative. You just follow the recipe and instant composer. So he's coming up with all these forms which the Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven never heard of. So I would take all that stuff with a real grain of salt, because it takes the creativity out of music. You start analyzing this stuff according to what's the exposition and what's the development section and what's the recapitulation, and you just kind of get used to the idea that this is where this is supposed to happen, this is where this is supposed to happen, and you lose all the surprise in it. It tries to fit it into a cookie cutter, more or less. But what Beethoven is doing with the Eroica, because of what Dave was saying, of the topic that's actually involved, he is pushing the symphonic form to its limits, far, far beyond anything he'd ever done before. And in fact, when he was working on his 7th symphony, he told a friend, he said, I'm writing a symphony now that will be my greatest. And his friend said, oh, you mean even greater than the 5th? Because that was your greatest up to now. And Beethoven said, no, the Eroica. That was the greatest.
Yeah, another question I have is, in your video on the Welsh coal miners.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I had the chance to show the Chinese that video and some of David Shaven's work, and it got quite an electric response. I wanted to ask you about, one of the questions that came up was, how is a symphony or a musical section harmonized with the chorus in the early days of, in the 19th century when it premiered in St. Petersburg, versus how versus how orchestras are tuned these days?
Well, that's a big question, and I can't really answer that for you. I have written something on the St. Petersburg chorus that it was considered by many to be the best chorus in the world at the time, because in the efforts to develop St. Petersburg, not just musically, but in terms of architecture and everything else. They imported a string of Italian opera composers for about 70 years, and they developed the chorus and trained them in bel canto. So at the time of Catherine the Great, when Galuppi was head of the chorus, he said, "I've never heard such a magnificent chorus in all of Italy." But it was very clear that the chorus was trained on bel canto, and there are indications that the St. Petersburg Philharmonic was also trained in bel canto. But exactly how that worked is not something that I know. I will say something about the Welsh miners, though, which is interesting, because I was sitting there thinking, oh, there must have been some great musician who trained all of these people. Their national composer was Joseph Perry, who wrote the famous Mfanwu. And when I read about him, he was a mine worker. He was a 15-year-old boy, and when the mines went on strike, the other workers taught him solfege, how to read music, how to write music. So they had a system themselves where they educated each other. And I think that's a really amazing tradition that has to be looked into a lot more.
And one final question, is there any way we can get that Welsh coal miner video with Chinese subtitles?
Well, I don't know. You'll have to provide them. I don't speak Chinese.
Fair enough. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, Mary Jane has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Went through the name so fast, I hope that somebody transcribes this. But anyway, in terms of this question of importing the American Revolution into Europe and back again, I mean, it was James Monroe, not Madison, but Monroe was Washington's ambassador to France, basically, and that they were very active in trying to help free Lafayette. Lafayette is convinced then, when he's released, to send his son to live with George Washington. So there's a real, and I'm sure Shaven must have much more on this, but I haven't seen any of his written work yet.
I don't know why he let me away with saying Madison.
I don't know either. That's not like Shaven. So anyway, I've been looking more and more at the Washington. Washington was not just a man for America per se. He organized an international conspiracy, if you will, to continue to help, build this nation and then export it back. So I'm sure Shaven has more on that. And if you have more, Fred.
Well, no, I think that's what I tried to address at the beginning, that this really was an international revolution, and that people who were trying to do similar things around the world saw that and saw that if it succeeded in America, it would be to their benefit. So we got a lot of support from unexpected quarters. And I think that's the way it should be looked at. I think you're right. Washington was a man for the world. Certainly Ben Franklin was. But other countries that came to our support saw it the same way. They saw it as a beginnings of a global revolution.
Can I be heard?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
If it's, I think I said Monroe, but if it's Madison in my paper, I'm going to switch it pretty quickly. And Mary Jade, I'll send it over to you. That's for sure. My apologies. But the key thing there, it's not a, Monroe succeeded Gouverneur Morris, who did most of the work, carried most of the weight of trying to help Lafayette and Adrienne. And the son, Lafayette's son, was sent to live with Hamilton, while the two of them were in prison. It wasn't so much afterwards. He came back afterwards. But besides those details, Alexander Hamilton is right in the middle of the escape efforts from the beginning of the escape efforts to try to get Lafayette out of prison, the pressure to put on the British. And without going into those details here, the key thing is Lafayette was not simply viewed as revolutionary. He was viewed as the American revolutionary. The British king and queen and Pitt didn't mind working with revolutionaries. They were doing all sorts of destructive things in France. The reason the Emperor of Austria, Franz II, said his hands were tied is because his hands were tied. The alliance was the British, the Prussians, and the Austrians. And the orders were coming from Pitt and from the royal family itself because of Lafayette's role not as a French revolutionary leader, but as the American figure. And they're very clear about that. You can't run counter-gang operations when there's something better on the scene. You have to take that away and then get everybody, you know, passionately going after each other with no solution.
Okay, nobody else has their hand raised. Is there anybody else who has a question or comment?
Yeah, Pamela wanted to know about Beethoven's demise. Perhaps you go into that. Some people thought he was poisoned. And
I don't really have anything to say at that. I've heard that before. I've looked at it. I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. He was 57, which is seems young to us now, but in those days was not. Do you have anything on that, David?
No, I agree. I mean, I think what they said about when Beethoven was looking into the question of Mozart's poisoning, he was convinced of it, but they thought that the blame was being put on Salieri. And Beethoven's comment was that he might have poisoned many moments of his life, of Mozart's life, but he had nothing to do with Mozart's poisoning, death. And I think that's the case. On Beethoven, you're just looking at a situation in Europe from 1815 to 1827 when he died, where it's one man against the world, you know, and they thought they had him contained. You know, sort of asking why after one or two attempts against Lynn, he was allowed to live. It's because they think they had the guy contained. And that's the real possibility, and I think that's the case with Beethoven.
well, this has been a real inspiring class, you know, on what it is to be human. So I just wanted to make that comment.
I got a question. This is Rick.
Go ahead, Rick.
Just in the light of what David just said about it being very clear that Lafayette was seen as a world revolutionary, certainly for the American Revolution, that would make the case stronger for Fidelio and so forth, where some people might have had some questions or vagueness, but that would make the case for Beethoven being an American composer.
Yeah, well, David, in your article, you mentioned that when Lafayette was arrested, they basically had no legal basis for it, but they just arrested him because he was the American threat in France.
Yeah, he was September, October of 1792. He tried his best to stop the insanity in Paris and decided the whole thing was collapsing. And with a group of 40 people headed for the American embassy in The Hague, he was in northeastern France, where his army was. So he's no friend. The rulers in France are not his friends, and they're fighting a war against the Austrians and the Prussians here and the British. And he's planning to go to America in 1792. So the arrest is sort of you know, it's almost one of these things like they do to us. Can they do that? It was flagrant. You know, the actual when they got detained, they were going to be treated as, oh yeah, we're convinced that you guys are not enemies, you're fleeing from our enemies, we're going to let you pass on. But before 24 hours were up, they stopped the detainment, and they got Lafayette and two others whose names I'm forgetting are the ones that Lafayette had two fellow prisoners. They were in isolation, but there were two other people who had to stay in prison all those 5 years. And they made a point that the memos went out immediately to the courts in Vienna and in London. And I have a quote in that paper about the British Queen being very, I forget the quote, but it's very nasty, very blunt about what they did to us, what this guy did to us 10, 20 years ago, and why he's, why we got him now. But it comes up in several different places that there's a whole bunch of French constitutional monarchists who are hardly revolutionaries. They wanted the king to agree to a constitution. Some of them were even sort of this British style operation. Some of them were more Republican about it, but they were all gone after. None of them kept in prison. And the reasons over the course of the 5 years, it was very clear. There was a whole series of quotes where it's because he represents the American Revolution. And that's not going to, basically, it's not going to come here to Europe. So that was, Don had the original genius insight into Don Fowle on that Fidelia would actually be based upon something real. But at the time, he had one or two quotes from Adrienne's letters about their views while they're in prison of that Pitt is behind things. But it's a very provable case. And Beethoven is just he's talking with the general he first talks with in 1798 in Vienna, who's now the ambassador from France, is a friend of Lafayette's. So he's a fellow general, French general. His name starts with a B. I'm forgetting what it is. And so Beethoven is getting a direct briefing on the situation. 1797, by the way, is the year that all that poetry and everything else was breaking out in Paris about maybe getting Lafayette out, and all the stuff that's used in the plays written about Lafayette, of which Bouilly was one of them. Might be more than you wanted, but the point is that the unique situation of Lafayette was very clear. Provably the case between his being kept behind bars for so long.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. John Covici, do you still want to ask a question? You had your hand up a minute ago.
Yes, I was wondering about Beethoven's deafness, whether that was some kind of induced, because I understand that he was very, he was washing his floor all the time, and I was wondering if he thought there was a problem, people were out to destroy him or whatever.
Not to my knowledge.
I'll give you one angle on that. Yeah, I think it occurred when he went through Regensburg, the Turnentaxis area where he stayed there, because his first complaints come in right after that. I have no other evidence. I'm betting on somebody. I'm betting on the Turnentaxis crowd. This is around 1797. He's only like 26, 27 years old. The Heiligenstadt statement is 6 years later when it's so dramatically worse. But I don't. If there's any, I've looked at it. If there's anybody to be suspected, I think that's where the digging would have to go on.
All right, we're pretty much out of time. Fred, do you want to say anything to wrap up?
No, not really. I thank David for coming in and joining us on this. I think it's added a lot to it, and I hope it gives people an idea, a better idea of where Beethoven is coming from and making his life and his fight intelligible. And we look forward to the next one.
Well, thank you very much for kicking us off in this summer lecture series.
Okay.
This was great. So I just want to tell people what we have coming up. In 2 weeks, we have the next class, which will be given by Matthew Ogden on the genius of Wilhelm Furtwängler. So you can keep an eye on your email if you usually get emails from the chorus, or go to the webpage of the chorus, which I'm going to put in the chat right now, because it's also a place you can go to join the chorus if you're not already singing with us. And I just want to invite everybody to sing with us, join the chorus if you haven't already. We are conducting rehearsals several times a week on Zoom. And right now, as Fred referenced, we're working on the Beethoven Missa Solemnis. We have rehearsals every Thursday evening at 7:30 Eastern, and sectional rehearsals and other small rehearsals throughout the week. So if you're interested in joining the chorus, you can find out more on the website. So thanks a lot, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks.